Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sunday School lesson for March the 3rd, 2024. It's an Old Testament lesson from the book of Exodus entitled Obedience in Community. We think about individual obedience a lot, but this lesson shifts that to have us consider what it means to the community of faith when we are obedient or disobedient. Notice there are quite a few verses, Exodus 20, verses 1 through 19. So I'm not going to be able to go into great detail on all the verses, though I've picked a couple to focus in on. Our unit for the next 4 weeks is entitled Learning Humility. You know, I've had to learn lessons in humility throughout my life. I'm not very good at it, but I'm better at it now than I was when I was younger. Sometimes we learn lessons of humility, and these are hard lessons. But we're going to be looking at foundational moments in Hebrew history that focus on how we are to relate to ourselves and to God, to remain humble, in other words. Today's lesson, we look at Exodus 20, which is the giving of the Ten Commandments, or what's called the Decalogue. Next week, it's showing patience while we are wandering in the wilderness. It's hard to be patient when we are struggling. Then we will look at cleansed in heart from Psalm 51. And then the final lesson is Christ in mind, which takes a prophecy from Isaiah and amplifies it with the great Christ hymn of Philippians 2. So these are wonderful lessons for the period of time that we're in for Lent this year. In these lessons, we're going to see how the Ten Commandments help us to form and maintain community, or community of faith, or maintain good relationships with those that we go to church with, and with God and with each other. The byproduct of that is that humility often means waiting for God, trusting God, obeying God when it's not easy to do. So that's these lessons are going to be insightful and helpful to us. Today we're focusing on obedience in community, or how being obedient to the Ten Commandments helps us function better as a group of believers. Just a reminder, we are in the season of Lent. Lent is an Old English word for spring. It calls to mind the 40 days of Jesus' temptation, and that as believers we are imitating some of what Jesus went through in the 40 days leading up to the Easter miracle. Lots of key, significant, spiritual aspects in some of these days in Lent. Reminder of our church, in our church year, Lent period is the 40 days prior to Easter, starting with Ash Wednesday, ending with Good Friday, and this is the season of Lent, 6 weeks of Lent. Here is a useful graphic that lays out the Sundays of Lent, week by week, gives some indication of the week, a first reading, a psalm reading, a second reading, and a gospel reading. Today we're in the third Sunday of Lent, and we are dealing with a first reading. This is from Exodus 20. Now, the scripture that we look at is not haphazard, or it's not just thrown together, but it's prescribed by the common lectionary, says what scripture we are to look at. Sometimes our lesson writers will choose a gospel lesson or a psalm lesson, but for today we are focusing on a first reading from Exodus 20. Just a reminder, there are 6 weeks in Lent as opposed to 4 weeks of Advent. That's what I'm trying to say. Just bit of background information about the book of Exodus. The main point is that in a series of dramatic miracles, God steps into human history and rescues the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. God then organizes the children into a nation and provides them with laws for how they are to live. The book of Exodus is one of the books of Moses, traditionally ascribed to Moses as the author, not only of Exodus, but the first 5 books of the Bible. The historical background of this book is that as the tribes of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sought relief from famine in Egypt, where they were welcomed at first, there arose a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And so the welcoming turned into captive slavery and misery for the children of Israel. After a series of confrontations with Moses and with the help of miracles from God, Pharaoh reluctantly releases the children of Israel, allowing them to exodus Egypt and go on their journey into the promised land. So the book of Exodus contains the narratives regarding the first Passover and the giving of the 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, which is our focus of attention today. As far as our lesson background is concerned, Exodus is really prehistory. You can't excavate and find items talked about in the scripture back that far. We can go back probably to David, but when we're getting to pre-David history of Israel, it's really, we're dealing with the realm of prehistory. No artifacts are there, so there's legend and many confusing aspects of this history for us. The 10 Commandments that we have, everybody knows the 10 Commandments. You don't need to go to Sunday school or church to know about them. We studied them in school. They've influenced social contracts, legal codes, and community life throughout the realm of history. I'm going to call them sometimes the 10 Commandments, sometimes the Decalogue, meaning 10 words, one word ascribed to each commandment. But the Decalogue is really the beginning of legal history. We can find the verses that we're looking at today are repeated later in Deuteronomy 5. So some scholars say that this document that includes the 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, had a history that was independent of the writing of the book of Exodus, because it appears multiple locations. One thing I never thought about until I studied this week is that the 10 Commandments provide commands and prohibitions. We're to do certain things and avoid certain things, but note, no penalties are given or ascribed to this. So it's not yet a code of law. It's going to take the priests and prophets and other later figures in Jewish history to take the Decalogue and refine it and make more laws and to indicate what the penalty for violating these laws are. But here in our lesson today, we don't have the full code. We just have the commands and prohibitions. It's a good beginning. You need this as a foundation, but this is the part that I'm bringing to the lesson today that you might not have gotten from just studying the lesson in our lesson book. But even so, the Decalogue is far inferior to the ethic introduced by Jesus. In the ancient Middle East, you can see that Egypt down in the lower left, that's where the children of Israel are now. They're going to be released and go up there to Canaan, but I want to draw your attention to Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is the cradle of civilization, and this is where one of the first, probably the first human code of law existed, in the form of the Code of Hammurabi, who was the ancient ruler of ancient Babylon or Iraq in Mesopotamia. Here we are, though, we're dealing with the children of Israel way down in Egypt. Here's a close-up of the land of Mesopotamia during the time of Hammurabi, who was a great king of Babylon. This precedes the Babylonian conquest of the Israelites that happened later. But I want to call your attention to Elam, which is an ancient kingdom of Iran. And this is one of our mission partners in our church. We annually give money to a ministry in Elam. It turns out that in modern history, Elam is one of the hotbeds of Christian evangelism, and so it's really a privilege for us to donate money during our mission emphasis to ongoing work there in Elam, or modern day Iran. But here's Hammurabi. He's the man that precedes Moses in terms of the drafting of a code of laws. We don't have that yet with the Israelites, but he was king of ancient Babylon, and a lot of good things we can go back to him. Also, modern descendants of Hammurabi haven't always lived up to his high standards or ideals. But when we talk about the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Christian Old Testament, or the Decalogue given in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, these provide a basic moral compass that's useful for society, necessary but insufficient to give us a full-blown ethic or Christian ethic. It's useful, necessary, it's foundational, but it's not the end word. And as I'm trying to indicate to you, that it's not the first or the most complete statement of a legal code, but it's a good start. The Code of Hammurabi indirectly and directly influences the Hebrew Decalogue, according to scholars. Eye for an eye, and there are many other aspects of what will come to be known as the Law of Moses that was first formulated in the Code of Hammurabi. So, you know, there's mixing and matching. There's some element of divine causality mixed with some of what people found useful. In researching this lesson, I find that the human species has always practiced altruism, or that means being kind when you don't really have to, going beyond the law because it's useful long term. Some people will say, well, I don't care about other people. They have their needs. They'll have to take care of themselves. But if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it really hurts yourself in the long run. So it's useful for us to go beyond what are the strict legal requirements and be nice and helpful to those that we may not be legally required to help. So altruism, or going beyond the law, or being kind, has always been useful for humans. However, it gets its first working in our lesson today. Excuse me. In the law of Moses. But even the amplification of the Decalogue by the Hebrew priests to include various punishments is still an incomplete or defective ethic. It doesn't prescribe what we are to say to do to those that are poor or without hope in the world. The law doesn't address that. It took the Hebrew prophets much later, as they wail and call to task the rich and powerful, to show kindness to those that are in need. This is an amplification of the law of Moses. Goes beyond the law and goes into the need for altruism, or the need to go beyond the law to help those who don't have the ability to help themselves. That's the intermediate step. But I can think maybe you can see where I'm building to this, that even that doesn't do justice to what Jesus brought. Jesus is the one that changed the world, that moved beyond the need for a code of law and said that's not good enough, no matter how thoughtful it is, but we must take into account those who cannot help themselves. So the law, the Decalogue, the Hebrew prophets of Israel and Judah, preaching that we must show kindness to those that are poor and helpless. The law is not enough. We've got to go beyond the law of Moses. The Hebrew Decalogue, think about this, urged fairness for fellow Hebrews, not necessarily aliens and strangers, much less enemies. So you can see how Jesus' ethics that said love your enemies, include others, not just your own family and those of your own kin. It was expected, of course, in the ancient world that one would look after one's own family, but those without a family were out of luck. No help for them. There was some modest help for widows and aliens in the laws of harvest, whereby it said during times of harvest they left the corners unharvested. They didn't go back and pick it clean, but left some fruit and some on the vine so that those who were poor could glean and have the means for at least a meal. But there was no general help, not even down to the Greek and Roman times. Nothing outside of individual alms was there to protect the needy, except the kingdom movement of Jesus, who said, reach out, show kindness. The Christian church actually changed the world to go beyond the law of Moses and to treat everyone in need as worthy of help. To go beyond the demands of the law. Quite a lesson. So it's Jesus preaching the good news. What my author that I'm reading, Bert Ehrman, calls prophetic apocalypse on steroids. Is what Jesus was. He was taking the word of the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, to help those and amplifying them to the point where all come under the influence of God's kingdom, and we are to show kindness to all. And it changed the world. The Decalogue was the beginning of the change, but it was not perfected until we have the kingdom movement of Jesus. This is most clearly shown in Matthew's gospel, or at least Bart Ehrman says that Matthew is the gospel writer who does the best job of tying Jesus' message back to the Hebrew prophets. And so by extension, we can say that it goes back to the law of Moses as well. Here's my man, Bart D. Ehrman. I'm praying for him. I want you to pray with me. He's now a professor at the University of North Carolina, written extensively. I have maybe 20 of his books, studied some of his courses. Quite an engaging guy. He has a history of evangelical Christianity. He's a Moody Bible Institute, where the Bible is our middle name. He studied the scripture, tried to memorize vast amounts of it, went on to Wheaton College. What do you know about Wheaton College? That's where Billy Graham went. So he was pursuing this evangelical Christianity. And then he went on to Princeton Theological Seminary for his doctorate, and he kind of lost his faith there. So he started off gung-ho, believer, very conservative. He was trying to bring Christianity into the modern age, but he lost energy, and now he's kind of an agnostic or even an atheist, but I'm hoping that he sees the light in his older age, as others have. I know Bob Harrington, the chaplain of Bourbon Street, also started off conservative and then kind of drifted away, but came back to the faith. And I'm hoping the same goes for Bert. I mention him because I'm studying his Gospel of Matthew, in which he ties the ethic of Jesus as an extension of the Hebrew prophets, and therefore an extension of the law of Moses. So I'm going to read these verses. I can't go into great detail on all of them, but I'm going to we'll talk about one or two of them. So here are verses 1 through 7 of Exodus 20. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of my name, the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Wow, quite a few verses here. Here at Mount Sinai, Israel heard Yahweh speak, not through Moses, but directly. God speaking directly to them. And from these words, it's clear Yahweh allows no substitutes or rivals. There are to be no idols or images of other gods or even of Yahweh, and the violation of which brings communal consequences. This is amplified in the New Testament, where it says that the parents drink the bitter wine, but the children's teeth are set on edge. That's one way of saying that those who violate the law in this generation will be punished. There'll be communal consequences down to the third or fourth generation. But notice that those who keep the law will be blessed to the 1,000th generation. So we must not misuse the name of Yahweh. And when I was growing up, it was, oh, you better not utter a cuss word or a swear word. But it's far more significant than just crude swearing. We're not to use the name of Yahweh in any frivolous way. And so this has led to a reluctance to say or write Yahweh. And we could go into a great deal of discussion about that, and where the Hebrew writers in the Hebrew text, when Yahweh, the letters for Yahweh appears, they dare not even pronounce it, but they would say Adonai or Jehovah. They would not dare to utter God's name for fear of transgressing this commandment. Much more we could say about it, but let's move on to 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Wow. So Sabbath observance is centered in the pattern of creation that's given in the book of Genesis. God ceased from all work after establishing Sabbath. Pastor Cobbin calls it Shabbat. I don't know how to say it. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'll just continue to call it Sabbath. So, according to one reading of this early scripture, Sabbath is the high point of creation, not humanity. Now that may be a misreading or an overemphasis that the priests put on this, but in the writings by the priests themselves, there's nothing any higher than the Sabbath. The only instruction is that we're not to labor. There's no command to worship or to play. But some overdo the command. But here again, Jesus, we have to think about what he did. Jesus got it right. You know, they were so careful not to do any work on the Sabbath that they wouldn't do good, or they wouldn't heal someone on the Sabbath. Or in the modern day, if you're in Jerusalem on the Sabbath, you don't want to push an elevator button because that may be considered work. Well, that seems to me to be pushing it to the extreme. Thank goodness Jesus taught that the Sabbath was meant to serve man, not man to serve the Sabbath. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about this ordering of this Sabbath preservation in terms of the creation story. In Genesis, God blesses and hallows the Sabbath day, and he does not do this. God does not bless and hallow any of the other days of creation, only the Sabbath. But Sabbath observance, of course, is not official until Moses receives these commandments, which is part of our text today. But notice in our text that the Sabbath rest extends to all peoples, animals, and not in our text, but even the earth itself. There are further prescriptions that say you're not to farm the earth for some periods of time. So all creation is to benefit from rest, from not being pushed, for rest and renewal. Here's a key point that pastors don't like, usually. It's not rest in order to worship, but it is rest as worship. In other words, no prescription for what we're to do. We're just to refrain from working. Now, it's good to worship, but it's an overreading of this to say that God created the Sabbath so that we would have a day to worship. I want to show you the symmetry in this Genesis creation story. Wherein the priestly writers who wrote this made the Sabbath, not man, as the crown of creation. I've heard sermons, the last sermon that we had in this church about the creation rightfully depicted man as the crown of creation, but these early writers didn't see it that way. Sabbath is so important that not even God can work on the Sabbath. But these priests were proved wrong ultimately by Jesus because man is more important than Sabbath. I want to show you the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1. On the first day, light was created. And on the second day, the sky was created. 2 things were created on day 3, dry land and plants. So day 1 is Sunday, Monday, day 2, Tuesday's day 3. Wednesday would be day 4, the stars are created. Day 5, the fish are created. Thursday. And then Friday, again, there are 2 things. See the symmetry between day 3 and day 6? These writers had had 8 categories of creation that they had to define into 6 ways so that made room for the Sabbath to have its own important day, the Sabbath day, Saturday, which was the crown of creation. There's a joke that John Dominic Crossan tells about how people working on an assembly line during the week, you don't want to get a car that's built on Friday afternoon because, people are tired. You're liable to have a lot of quality problems in work that's done late in the week. I doubt that applies to God's work of creation. But you can see that for the Hebrew writers of Mosaic law, that the Sabbath was the most important thing. And of course, that was their bailiwick, the priestly concern. So it's natural to take what we do as most important. But I'm grateful that Jesus got it right and said that now man is really the most important thing. All right, so the thing is, we could go into that amount of detail on every one of these verses, but we would be here for hours. So I'm going to move on and read these final verses. It says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land, and that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die." Wow, we could go into so much detail on these things. But the faith of community, or the church community, or the community of faith, like a republic like the U.S., is fragile. It takes great effort to maintain, so therefore we need rules, what we need to do and not do. So for God's people, the foundation of community is the Decalogue, are these 10 words. The first 3 commandments teach us how to relate to God. And then the remaining 7 teach us how to relate to each other. All 10 are about how to relate to God and how to relate to each other. We can't just relate to God and not to people, or people and not to God. It doesn't work that way. To be fully functioning people, we must abide by a vertical dimension, which is us and the Lord, and a horizontal dimension, which is our community of other believers. So what are our issues today? Well, the ethical foundation of our faith community is built on the Decalogue. All 10 commandments are intertwined. You can't just pick and choose. They're all significant. Some say the first one is the most important, but not so. They're all of equal importance. But here's the thing. The preaching of Jesus expanded and clarified how we are to relate to God and to each other. This law of Moses says it's a sin to commit adultery, but Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says it's an equal sin just to look at someone with lust. So Jesus extended the law. Our code of ethics is not prescribed just by the Decalogue. We have to entertain the spiritual dimension. The law in itself is sterile. It can identify problems, but not effect solutions. It takes the radical ethics of Jesus to put the correct emphasis into our lives. Wow. Thanks for joining me today. Again, don't take me too seriously. There are so many ways to interpret Scripture, and so much that I have left out. I may be missing entirely some key important things, but my views are an amateur layperson's view of what seems to be important. Remember the prayer concerns of our church. Pray for them every day. Hope to see you here next week, and I hope that you will join and link with the Sunday school class so that you can discuss these things firsthand. A million thanks to Daryl Elster, our technical wizard who produces and records these sessions. They just would not have happened without the good work of Daryl. So until next week, I will say goodbye.